Welcome back to our in-depth and exciting conversation about Joseph Campbell and his thousand-faced hero. So this podcast is going to focus on the next phase of the adventure of the hero, which is initiation. Joseph Campbell's famous The Adventure of the Hero, also known as The Hero's Journey. Part 2, The Initiation. The first part of Campbell's initiation is what he calls the road of trials. The hero is initiated on his or her journey by going on the path, going down the road, as it were. And the trials that Frodo has to face over the course of his journey challenge him, put his life in jeopardy, but more importantly, make him a stronger hero, change who he is, and make him more capable of accomplishing the many tasks. Repeatedly, he has to deal with the ring wraiths in their various forms, whether they're on horseback or riding fell beasts. But this is a constant source of threat for Frodo. Obviously, Gollum presents himself as a threatening figure and often complicates the road and the journey with increasing trials. But if we want to just break it down into some of the more specific moments, Moria fills Frodo's life with a number of trials, and in many ways, Moria represents a more traditional belly of the whale, because it's the descent into the underworld of the mine, and it results in the loss of the father figure or the guardian or the leader, which is, of course, Gandalf. He has to contend with the various goblins in Moria. He also has to contend with the orcs, both the Uruk-hai from Saruman and also Sauron's orcs in Mordor. Many of the trials that Frodo encounters is simply a result of the landscape. Unfortunately, Frodo also is hindered by the humans, primarily the Gondorians. First, it's Boromir, who is a trial for Frodo, and then his brother Faramir. And of course, for the rest of the Fellowship, their father, Denethor, becomes quite a bit of a trial. Frodo also has to encounter Shelob. And, most importantly, maybe, personal weakness. He has to overcome his hobbit nature. He has to overcome the Baggins side of him that is preventing him from rising to his potential. And he has to deal with the struggles of the weight of the ring itself, the weariness of the journey, the lack of food and rest. So all these things work variously to further Frodo's journey down the road of trials, although Moria is kind of a special trial that could be seen as the belly of the whale, if you don't want to consider him being stabbed with the Morgul blade to be his belly of the whale. But Shelob also has a very special place, which we'll talk about in a moment. The next phase of Campbell's initiation is called the meeting with the goddess. In many of the hero's journey adventures and mythologies, the meeting with the goddess actually occurs very close to the end of the journey, if not after the successful completion of the quest. And more often than not, it is manifested through marriage. In most mythologies, the hero is male, and the goddess is not literalized as a goddess, but rather as a companion, oftentimes a princess or someone of noble or significant lineage. We see this particularly in Lord of the Rings, not with Frodo's adventure, but with the hero's journey that Aragorn goes along, which does culminate in a very ritualistic marriage as king and queen of the Middle-earth. Frodo's meeting with the goddess is literal. He actually meets what for a hobbit would be considered a goddess, the elf queen Galadriel. So we'll call her a queen, but because of her rather supernatural powers and abilities, she is of a goddess ilk. Either way, the meeting with the goddess usually results in the hero's empowerment, one way or another. With Frodo, he is literally given talismans and powers that he'll be able to use to complete his quest. Acting almost as a contrasting phase, the next point of initiation is the woman as temptress. Whereas one female figure can represent the goddess, another can represent temptation and the potential of the hero falling from grace and giving in to weakness. Now, on the one hand, this can be psychological, and the woman is not a literal woman at all. It just represents, in somewhat sexist terms, the man's weakening, the man's giving in to temptation and falling or failing when it comes to the quest. Oftentimes, though, the woman is literalized as a woman, or a woman demon, or a woman-coded female beast, as in the Medusa in ancient mythology. For Frodo, I think the most prominent candidate for woman as the temptress is Shelob. And Shelob does function in a certain capacity as a temptress for Frodo, because her assault on him makes him want to relinquish the quest. He's about ready to give up anyway with the abandonment of Sam, and once he is injected with poison, he basically dies. This could also be seen as another belly of the whale moment. The fourth step of Campbell's initiation is what he calls atonement with the Father. Another stage of the hero's journey that's somewhat difficult to align strictly with Frodo is atonement with the Father. In some ways, we can, of course, read Gandalf as a key father figure, one from whom Frodo is estranged because he thinks Gandalf has died. And there does have to be a reuniting there, but it really doesn't happen until after the quest is resolved, and I don't think that in any way Frodo needs to atone as far as Gandalf is concerned. An interesting way to read this would be to apply Boromir to the father figure, although I think Boromir, especially in the films, is more of a father figure to Merry and Pippin. But there is a sense of estrangement from Boromir, then Frodo does ultimately forgive him. In both the movie and the original books, that forgiveness is done by proxy through Faramir. There are other father figures that are particularly powerful for other characters, such as the relationship between Pippin and Denethor. But for Frodo, you really don't get that. You can maybe read Sam somewhat as a father figure, and maybe the atonement with the Father for Frodo comes near the end of the quest when he must give himself over to Sam and trust Sam's judgment and reconcile with Sam after the parting at Shelob's cave. And I think that's not a bad way to read it. Another way to consider it, though, is Frodo's relationship with Bilbo. Bilbo, of course, is the closest thing Frodo has to a literal father, and their relationship is somewhat rocky throughout. I personally think Bilbo is the most logical choice for the atonement with the Father, because he is the father from whom he is estranged initially, and whose quest footsteps he follows for the majority of the novel, as the bearer of the ring that Bilbo once bore, the inheritance of the ring from the father to the son, and the ultimate reconciliation that Bilbo made errors and wasn't a perfect person. You can also read into this the power, the symbolic power that Bilbo's sparing of Gollum's life, initially criticized by Frodo, ultimately ends up being the whole turning point in the quest, as somewhat presciently predicted by Gandalf. After the atonement with the Father, the hero encounters what is called
apotheosis, which is not nearly as complicated as it might sound.
Apotheosis, in essence, is to become like God, or to become godlike, in which the hero is able to obtain great powers and great abilities. In The Lord of the Rings, the apotheosis is pretty easy to identify. It's the One Ring. The wielder of the One Ring very much has godlike powers and has the ability to control others, to pass unseen, many other supernatural traits, often those associated with a divine being. The problem, of course, with Lord of the Rings is that apotheosis is very, very dangerous and very tempting. In fact, if you're going to do a Freudian reading of the Lord of the Rings, the ring could actually be the woman who is the temptress. The ring being, of course, a yonic symbol of femininity and birth, and being the source of power that is always tempting and potentially corrupting the ring bearers. Frodo's apotheosis, then, is a giving in to this temptation because, as we often kind of forget, Frodo is corrupted by the end of the novel. Ultimately, his apotheosis causes him to relinquish the quest at the very, very end as he decides he's going to keep the ring and remain powerful and to challenge Sam and the will of the others. So apotheosis can be a good thing and a bad thing, and in Lord of the Rings we see this apotheosis in certainly a negative manifestation.
The final phase of the initiation period is really the end of initiation and in many ways the completion of the main quest. He calls it the ultimate boon, which in other words means the successful completion of that which was supposed to be done. And this is pretty obvious in most narratives.
To put it simply, the ultimate boon simply means the accomplishment of the quest. It's when the prize is obtained, the dragon is slayed, whatever is necessary for the quest to be fulfilled and for the hero to fully become the hero as promised. The ultimate boon usually comes with some sort of sacrifice, either a sacrifice from the hero or on the part of various helper or guardian figures who've been involved in the quest from the beginning. In The Lord of the Rings, the ultimate boon is, of course, the destruction of the ring. That's been the whole point of the entire narrative and the goal of the fellowship. It's a little tricky, though, because Frodo doesn't really destroy the ring intentionally. The destruction of the ring is brought about by his conflict with Gollum. Depending on how you interpret both the film and the novels, Gollum is the one who is the ultimate boon, who manifests the ultimate boon. Gollum's sacrifice is quite clear. He dies. He loses his life. Although I think you could argue that Gollum's sacrifice actually is a freeing of himself. He is mastered by the ring, and so only through his death and the destruction of the ring is he freed. Frodo also must make a sacrifice, and his sacrifice is quite literal with the loss of a finger, which makes him Frodo of the 9 fingers forevermore. And by losing that appendage, which of course can be read in phallic terms, he is diminished, but it changes who he is and allows the quest to be fulfilled. I think this is really this point is worth discussing more in terms of Lord of the Rings, because Frodo is such a complicated hero at the end of the journey. Is he successful, or does he fail in his quest? Is it a quest that he could never have completed by himself and is only successful because of those who help him? Sam is somewhat interesting and should be considered in terms of the ultimate boon. While Sam doesn't physically lose anything or sacrifice anything, he is certainly sacrifices of himself and his time to make sure that it happens, and by taking care of Frodo all the way to the end.
Well, that's it for the initiation, which really takes the hero from the start of the journey up through till the end of the main quest. However, the adventures of the hero don't stop there. So in the next segment, I'll be talking about the phase that Campbell calls the return.